For 12 years, nobody in Millbrook Hollow spoke her name without lowering their voice first. Josephine Hart had not missed a single shot since she was 15 years old, and the town never forgave her for it. They called her cursed. They called her unnatural. They crossed the street rather than walk past her porch. Then outlaws rode toward Millbrook Hollow with enough guns to burn it to the ground, and the same town that shunned her had exactly one person left who could stop them. Before the smoke cleared over that valley, Millbrook Hollow would learn the difference between a curse and a gift, and which one had been living quietly on the edge of town all along. Millbrook Hollow sat quiet between two dry ridges, a farming town built on wheat, faith, and long memories. Wagons rolled through twice a week, carrying grain to the railhead and gossip back into town just as reliably. Wheat fields stretched gold across the valley floor each autumn, the kind of view postcards liked to sell as proof that frontier life could still be peaceful, orderly, safe. Nothing scandalous ever happened there, which made the one incident everyone remembered burn brighter with each retelling. The town valued order above almost everything else, and a woman who shot straighter than any man unsettled that order more than any outlaw ever could. Church bells rang every Sunday without fail, and every family in Millbrook Hollow occupied the same pew their grandparents had claimed a generation earlier. Small towns like this one prided themselves on knowing everyone's business and everyone's place within it. Superstition ran deep in Millbrook Hollow. Old women whispered that a woman's hand should never hold a gun that true, that such aim came from somewhere darker than skill. Farmers avoided her fields at dusk. Certain bad luck traveled with her the way smoke travels with fire. Josephine had heard every version of that whisper by the time she turned 20. She had heard the curse blamed for droughts, for sick cattle, for a barn fire 2 farms over that had nothing to do with her at all. She had stopped listening years ago, or so she told herself. Winters were the hardest, when snow kept most farmers indoors and idle talk found little else to occupy itself with besides old stories. Josephine learned to read the seasons of gossip the same way she read weather, understanding exactly when the whispers would grow loudest and when they would finally quiet down until the next incident stirred them awake again. Josephine Hart learned to shoot at 9 years old, taught by a father who needed a second hunter after illness took his strength. Her father had been a patient teacher, insisting she understand every rifle before she ever fired one. He taught her wind, distance, and stillness long before he taught her to pull a trigger, believing a steady mind mattered more than a steady hand. By 14, she could drop a running rabbit at 80 yards without pausing to aim twice. Neighbors called it luck the first few times, then skill, then finally something they preferred not to name at all. By 15, that same skill saved her life and her mother's, the night 2 robbers broke into their home believing a widow and her daughter would offer no resistance at all. The men had misjudged the house entirely, expecting easy plunder from 2 frightened women rather than a girl who had spent 6 years learning exactly how to hold still under pressure. Josephine killed 1 man that night. She wounded the second badly enough that he never rode through Millbrook Hollow again. The sheriff at the time praised her courage privately, then quietly asked her never to speak of the details publicly, worried the town would not know what to make of a girl capable of ending 2 grown men's ambitions in the space of a single dark hour. The town should have called her brave. Instead, they called her strange, then cursed, then finally just that Hart girl, spoken with a flinch instead of respect. Josephine built walls as thick as the ones around her family's farmhouse. She hunted alone, traded alone, and spoke to almost nobody except the one soul in town who never once looked at her with fear. Her mother passed quietly some years later, leaving Josephine entirely alone on the farm, tending fields and traps with the same steady discipline her father had once taught her. She grew accustomed to solitude the way other people grow accustomed to weather, simply accepting it as the shape her life had settled into. She still hunted every autumn, still traded pelts and grain at the mercantile with the same brisk efficiency, still nodded politely to neighbors who rarely nodded back with any real warmth. She had made peace, or something close to it, with the idea that Millbrook Hollow would never fully welcome her, choosing instead to build a life sturdy enough not to need that welcome. Her farmhouse stood a mile outside town, close enough for necessity, far enough for privacy, exactly the distance she preferred from people who had spent over a decade deciding who she was without ever once asking her directly. Emma Whitlow was 7 years old the day bandits ambushed her father's peddler wagon on the road into town. Josephine happened to be hunting nearby, drawn by gunfire instead of away from it. She dropped 2 of the 3 attackers before they reached the wagon, calm as if she were shooting rabbits instead of men. Emma's father survived. Emma never forgot the woman who saved him. The girl had watched the entire encounter from beneath the wagon, too frightened to scream, too fascinated by the calm stranger's steady hands to look away completely. She remembered every detail for years afterward. The wind moving through dry grass, the sound of the rifle, the silence that followed once the danger had fully passed. While the rest of Millbrook Hollow whispered about curses, 7-year-old Emma simply walked up to Josephine afterward and asked with the fearless honesty only children carry, "Will you teach me to shoot like that someday?" Josephine had not smiled in years. She smiled that afternoon. She almost refused, certain the town would only add one more reason to fear her if she started teaching their children anything at all. But Emma's father, grateful beyond argument, insisted his daughter learn from the only person in the valley skilled enough to matter. Over the next decade, Emma became the one person in Millbrook Hollow who visited Josephine's porch without an excuse, who sat beside her at church despite the stares, who called her Jo instead of that Hart girl. Emma's mother worried quietly at first, then openly, about the friendship's effect on her daughter's reputation in town. Emma never once cared, choosing loyalty over the comfort of easy acceptance from neighbors who judged Josephine without ever truly knowing her. By 10 years old, Emma had memorized every lesson Josephine offered, practicing stance and breathing in her own backyard long before she was permitted to touch a loaded rifle. Her father, grateful and quietly amused, allowed the friendship to flourish, recognizing in his daughter a steadiness he credited entirely to Josephine's patient influence. Other children in town occasionally teased Emma for her unusual friendship, though the teasing rarely lasted long once they realized how little it affected her. Emma simply shrugged off their comments the same calm way Josephine shrugged off the town's whispers, a resemblance that grew more apparent with each passing year. Their friendship deepened slowly, built on quiet afternoons and small, steady lessons. Josephine taught Emma to track deer through dry brush, to read wind before a shot, to trust her own hands instead of the fear other people tried to plant in her. She taught patience first, insisting Emma understand stillness before she ever touched a rifle, the same lesson her own father had once given her. Emma proved a quick study, eager and unafraid, absorbing every lesson with the kind of trust Josephine had not felt directed at her in years. Some afternoons they spoke little at all, content simply sharing the quiet discipline of tracking and waiting together. Emma taught Josephine, without ever meaning to, that not everyone needed a reason to be kind. She brought small gifts sometimes, wildflowers or a jar of her mother's preserves, offered without ceremony, as though friendship required no explanation between them. "Why do you still stay here?" Emma asked one afternoon, now 16, watching Josephine clean her father's old rifle. "After everything they've said about you?" Josephine considered the question longer than Emma expected. "This is still my home," she said finally, "even when it forgets to be kind." Emma never fully understood that answer until the autumn everything changed. Small moments built between them over the years, each one a quiet rebellion against the town's judgment. Josephine taught Emma to defend herself the year a drunk ranch hand cornered her outside the mercantile. Emma broke his grip using exactly the technique Josephine had shown her the week before. Word of that incident spread through Millbrook Hollow quickly, though most versions of the story conveniently forgot to mention who had taught Emma to fight back in the first place. Emma convinced her own mother to invite Josephine to Sunday dinner, the first invitation Josephine had received from any family in Millbrook Hollow in over a decade. Josephine arrived nervous, unsure whether to bring her rifle out of habit or leave it behind out of hope. She left it behind. Nobody at that table flinched once. The dinner itself passed simply, filled with ordinary conversation about crops and weather. The kind of unremarkable evening Josephine had almost forgotten was possible for someone like her. She walked home that night lighter than she had felt in years, Emma's laughter still echoing pleasantly in her ears. Later that year, when town boys mocked Emma for keeping company with the cursed woman, Josephine said nothing threatening. She simply stood beside Emma at the next town gathering, steady and unmoving, until the mockery ran out of momentum on its own. Emma squeezed her hand that evening, the first time anyone in Millbrook Hollow had touched Josephine without flinching first. Over the following seasons, Emma often brought her younger cousins along for shooting lessons, insisting Josephine's skill deserved more students than just herself. Josephine agreed reluctantly at first, then found unexpected purpose in teaching children who had grown up hearing rumors instead of truth, watching them learn to judge her by her patience rather than the town's old stories. Each lesson chipped quietly away at 12 years of isolation, one curious child at a time. Parents who dropped their sons and daughters off at the edge of Josephine's property began lingering longer each visit, exchanging brief, careful pleasantries that slowly grew warmer with each passing month. Word reached Millbrook Hollow that the Dutch Coleman gang, responsible for 3 burned towns already that year, had set their sights on the valley's harvest gold. News traveled fast once the first rider arrived from a neighboring county, breathless and pale, describing Coleman's men as merciless as wildfire and twice as fast. Farmers began hiding what gold they had, though everyone understood hiding alone would not save a town this small against 20 armed riders. The town's few able men gathered anxious meetings, counting rifles that numbered far short of what Coleman's 20 riders would bring. Most of Millbrook Hollow's men had never fired a shot at anything larger than a coyote, and panic spread through the meetings faster than any useful plan. Sheriff Tate, desperate and out of options, finally spoke the name nobody wanted spoken aloud. "We need Josephine Hart." The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Deacon Pratt, who had led the whispers against her for over a decade, finally muttered what everyone else was thinking. "We shunned that woman for 12 years. What makes you think she'll lift a finger for us now?" Sheriff Tate had no answer. He rode to her farmhouse anyway, out of desperation rather than hope, and found Emma already there, having heard the news an hour earlier. "They need you, Joe," Emma said quietly. "I know what they've done to you. I know you don't owe them anything." Josephine looked at the rifle above her fireplace, silent for a long moment. Sheriff Tate stood awkwardly near the doorway, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes directly after 12 years of avoiding her entirely. "I don't owe them," she said finally, "but I owe you a future in this town, and that means this town needs to still be standing." Sheriff Tate exhaled, relief and disbelief crossing his weathered face in equal measure, as though he had expected refusal until the very last word left her mouth. He lingered a moment longer, hat still in hand, finally finding words for something he had wanted to say for years. "For what it's worth, Miss Hart, I never believed the curse talk myself, just never had the courage to say so out loud." Josephine studied him for a long moment before answering. "Courage arrives late for most folks in this town. Better late than never, I suppose." He nodded, tipped his hat properly for the first time in 12 years, and rode back toward town to prepare the defenses she had requested. That night, Josephine faced the truth she had avoided for 12 long years. She could let Millbrook Hollow suffer the consequences of its own cruelty, ride away with Emma to somewhere kinder, somewhere her aim would be called a gift instead of a curse. The idea tempted her more than she wanted to admit, a decade of accumulated hurt whispering that the town deserved whatever Coleman's gang brought upon it. Or she could defend people who had never once defended her, for the sake of one girl who always had. She thought of her father, who taught her that a steady hand existed to protect, never to punish. She thought of the 12 years of whispered fear that had never once been fair. She thought of Emma, 16 years old, deserving a town that could still stand by the time she grew old enough to lead it herself. She sat awake most of that night, cleaning every rifle in the house, methodical and calm, the same discipline her father had drilled into her decades earlier. Fear tried to creep in more than once. She set it aside each time, focusing instead on distance, wind, and the ridge she already knew would offer the best position come morning. "Gather every rifle in town," Josephine told Sheriff Tate at dawn, "and clear the North Ridge. I need the high ground, and I need everyone else exactly where I tell them to be." For the first time in 12 years, Millbrook Hollow listened to her without question. Dutch Coleman's gang rode into the valley at midday, 20 riders strong, expecting an easy harvest of gold and terrified farmers. Dust rose behind their horses as they crossed the wheat fields, confident and loud, certain no small farming town could offer meaningful resistance. Coleman himself rode at the front, a scarred, arrogant man who had burned 3 towns already without meeting a single defender worth remembering. They found Josephine Hart on the North Ridge instead, rifle steady, wind already red, patience honed by 12 years of solitude nobody else in Millbrook Hollow had chosen to understand. She dropped the lead rider before he finished his first shouted threat. She dropped the second before his horse fully turned. The remaining riders scattered for cover, unprepared for resistance this precise, this calm, this utterly without hesitation. Confusion rippled through Coleman's ranks as 2 more riders fell in quick succession, each shot fired with the same unhurried certainty. Men who had ridden through burning towns without flinching suddenly found themselves diving for cover behind wagons and fence posts, uncertain where the next shot might land. Sheriff Tate's men held the choke point at the bridge exactly as instructed, forcing Coleman's remaining riders into range of Josephine's Ridge again and again. Emma, refusing to hide as ordered, ran messages between positions under fire, carrying ammunition to farmers too frightened to leave their cover alone. More than once, Emma pressed herself flat against fence posts as bullets cracked overhead, refusing every shouted instruction to retreat toward safety. She trusted Josephine's aim completely, and that trust carried her steady through a battlefield that would have paralyzed most grown men. Coleman himself charged the ridge directly, certain no woman could hold her aim against a man barreling straight at her. Josephine's hand did not shake. It never had. Her final shot ended the battle before Coleman came within 30 yards of her position. The valley fell silent, then erupted into something Millbrook Hollow had never once offered Josephine Hart in 12 years. Relief, gratitude, something close to awe. Farmers who had crossed the street to avoid her for over a decade now stood in the open, staring up at the ridge where she had held her ground alone against 20 armed men. Josephine walked down from that ridge slowly, rifle resting easy against her shoulder, meeting the stares of townsfolk who had spent 12 years refusing to meet hers. Nobody spoke at first. Then an old farmer, one of the loudest voices behind the curse rumors over the years, stepped forward and simply said, "Thank you." More followed, hesitant at first, then steadier, until Josephine found herself surrounded by a crowd offering the same gratitude they had withheld for over a decade. She accepted each word carefully, unused to kindness arriving in such quantity all at once. The town buried its dead, tended its wounded, and slowly, awkwardly, began to speak Josephine's name without lowering their voices first. Deacon Pratt, the same man who once led the whispers against her, was the first to shake her hand publicly at the following Sunday service, apology written plainly across his face, though he never quite managed the words. Josephine accepted the handshake without comment, understanding that some apologies arrived best left unspoken. Josephine did not need the words. She had Emma's hand in hers instead, steady and unashamed, exactly as it had been for a decade already. Millbrook Hollow never called her cursed again after that day. Children who once avoided her porch now gathered eagerly for shooting lessons, their parents no longer whispering warnings behind cupped hands. The wheat fields recovered by spring, gold and full again, and Josephine walked through town for the first time in 12 years without a single averted glance following her. Emma stayed close by her side through every season after, eventually teaching alongside her, the two of them building something Millbrook Hollow had never expected. An entire generation of steady, patient marksmen who judged skill by discipline rather than fear. They called her something else entirely, a word the town had taken 12 long years and one desperate battle to finally learn how to say. They called her home. The mercantile owner, who had once refused to meet her eyes across the counter, began setting aside the finest cuts of cloth whenever new shipments arrived, insisting she deserved first choice after everything she had done. Small gestures like these arrived slowly, awkwardly but steadily, each one another quiet correction to 12 years of silence. Josephine never expected an apology large enough to match the years she had lost to the town's fear. She found instead that she did not need one. The daily kindnesses, small and imperfect as they were, mattered more than any single grand gesture ever could have. She and Emma remained close for the rest of their lives. Two women the valley eventually came to see not as curse and student, but as the steadiest hands Millbrook Hollow had ever produced. Years later, mothers brought their daughters to Josephine's porch, instead of crossing the street to avoid it, asking the same question Emma once had. "Will you teach her to shoot like that?" Josephine always said yes. The end